Well, Scarbs, as you predicted after Jerez, we weren't going to see a lot of fireworks at Barcelona 1 in terms of upgrades, and you're absolutely correct. But there were a few details, particularly, let's start with the Mercedes and the rear wing mounting.
Yeah, well, when we saw the Mercedes first of all at the Jerez test, we noticed that the tail of the engine cover had a little forked end to it, as though it was going to wrap around a rear wing mounting. But in Jerez, they were still running the double rear wing mount, as you can see in the image there. What they unsurprisingly have done for the Barcelona test is they've gone to this, what's known as the Y-lon, or the Y-shaped pylon, where you have this horseshoe wrapped around the exhaust and then a single pillar supporting the rear wing, which is just a much neater way of doing things. And in the process of doing this, they've made a few other changes around the back there. They've actually brought the pillar in front of the rear wing, and they've also changed the DRS pod, which is rather unusual. It's aggressively angled down towards the wing. The entire rear wing assembly was new as well, a much larger flap on the rear wing and some detail changes on the end plates. The thing that probably caught most people's eye is that as much as they've gone to the single rear wing pillar, they initially continue to run with a massive Y100 monkey seat winglet, but mounted on a single strut from the centre of this pillar. And that appeared to break off. I didn't get the full story from Mercedes, but yeah, that broke, and they then reverted to a much smaller monkey seat for the balance of the test.
Well, it actually broke off right in front of me. I was opposite the pits at the time, and it broke off on the pit straight, flew up in the air and came down on the grass. The marshals went out and picked it up. I tried to persuade them to give it to me, but they wouldn't have any of that. And then very soon afterwards, we saw one of the Merc engineers on the other side of the road saying, "Give it to me, give it to me." But the interesting thing was that Lewis did another lap after that, and I was chatting to him afterwards, and he said he didn't even feel it come off at all. So I'm not quite sure what that says about monkey seats.
Well, probably on the straight you wouldn't notice it at all. I mean, it's a very subtle piece. It's one of these things, most teams fit them, and it's to get the airflow from the diffuser and the rear wing working together, and it just keeps the whole setup a bit more stable. It doesn't necessarily add lots more downforce or direct performance, but the drivers often in corners will feel a little bit more confident of the rear end because it's behaving a bit more stably rather than sort of the airflow breaking up.
Oh, well, Lewis is never lacking in confidence on the rear end regardless of what he's driving, so that's probably why it made no difference.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for that one, Scarbs. And then obviously the Lotus F1 team went away from Barcelona 2 feeling for the first time that they're in the real world for about 18 months, and that was very nice to see. And no surprise that they allowed both drivers to run soft tyres and get on with it and get the feel of what real grip is all about again. That was good to see as well. But some nice upgrades. We know that they rushed into the Jerez test, and they did a nice job going into Barcelona too.
Absolutely. We're starting to see the actual E23 aero package now, rather than what they managed to get on the car for that first test, as you pointed out. A couple of things. First of all, they've changed the barge boards that just sit in front of the side pods, and they've gone back to something that Lotus have played with on and off for quite a few years, which is having large slots in the barge board vane. And what they've done now is put two very deep slots in the top surface that effectively breaks the barge board up into three pieces. And this just allows the barge board to be curved more aggressively, and it also changes like the vortices and the airflow that trail off of that and then go around to the back of the car, because it's quite an influential aerodynamic device, even much as they seem to be getting smaller and smaller every year. So there's a little change there. And then later in the week, as we know, Mercedes now supply Lotus with the power units, and Lotus have obviously been feeling their way, and the temperatures weren't particularly high at either of the tests. And what they tried was a much smaller cooling package at the rear of the side pods, so the openings at the back of the Coke bottle shape were shrunk right down, much smaller, probably about a third smaller than the Jerez version. And the little exit that is formed around the exhaust pipe as well was closed up with a couple of little closing panels. So you can see that Lotus already feeling quite confident with this Mercedes PU, and particularly with the cooling that it requires in comparison to the Renault unit that they've been running. And they're able to tighten the back of the car up, which just improves performance in all areas.
Yeah, which again, as you just pointed out, says something about where they were at in terms of their baseline on the Renault cooling. Right, and then McLaren Honda. The new McLaren Honda, some upgrades there as well. We can continue to talk about the troubles they have with their Honda PU, and obviously the seal issue they have with the MGU. But as much as they weren't getting the running that they wanted, they have started to put some extra bits and pieces onto the car. I think there's still
a lot more to come on that area, and hopefully we'll see that in the test later this week. But there were some tweaks around the diffuser. You could start to see some of the complexity starting to creep in there with some details, particularly where the flap that's formed around the perimeter of the diffuser was the area where they made most of the changes, just adding bumps and curves there. And also we had the chance to have a proper look at this rear suspension setup. And as I think we said, I spoke to Matt Morris in Jerez and said, well, will they return with these rear wishbone fairings that were such a feature of the car last year? And they've kept the rear suspension arrangement that would allow them to use these fairings to add downforce at the rear of the car. But at the moment, there isn't a plan to run with these fairings, and they think that they can get the aero performance on the rear end with more conventional means rather than these big mushroom-shaped fairings. So what McLaren have had to do, which is quite extreme in terms of the structure at the rear end of the car, normally you have the upper and lower wishbones are mounted ahead of the rear axle line, and they are mounted to the gearbox, which obviously is a nice strong component and then feeds the load straight back into the engine in the chassis, and it's a nice stiff way of doing things. What McLaren have had to do, in order to get the wishbone over the back of the diffuser, they've had to move the lower wishbone behind the drive shaft, and it actually mounts completely to the rear crash structure, which obviously is a much more slender, arguably a less stiff component. So they probably had to bulk out that entire area in order to make it strong enough to pass the suspension loads through. And it mounts the rear wishbone nice and low, and this is one of the reasons McLaren have this very high and very flat-topped rear crash structure, is in order to package this rear wishbone in the right position. And then because it's sitting in that position, they've had to move the track rod, the tow control arm, in front of the drive shaft, which is where the wishbone would normally be. So it's quite a compromised package, and it's been a lot of effort for McLaren to do this. I imagine it was one of those things that was signed off long before Peter Prod turned up at the team and felt that they could get the performance without going to the extremes of these fairings. So it'd be interesting to see what McLaren do in that area, maybe at places like Monaco and Hungary, where they're high downforce. But at some of the other races, you would wonder if McLaren will want to repackage that rear end at some stage during the year. It's a big job. I don't know if their benefit is there, but it would certainly allow them probably to save some weight at the back of the car.
Another thing for the big job list there. Thanks for that very detailed analysis, Scarbs. One final question. Any more news on the famous box on the Sauber power unit, Ferrari power unit, which we think is also paralleled on the Ferrari power unit?
Yes, well, as I said, in Jerez, I saw something that I thought was quite unusual on the back of the Sauber, and started to do some investigation. Obviously, with your eyesight not being, particularly my eyesight not being fantastic, we were lucky to get some images of the Sauber rear end at Barcelona. And it still took a little while to work out that this box at the back is actually a pair of coolers that are split and then fed by these inlets either side of the roll hoop. But they're in a very unusual position. They're placed horizontally and quite high above the gearbox and the engine, and fed by a particularly unusual duct arrangement, which led me to think there was something else going on at the back there. But these do just appear to be either ERS or gearbox oil coolers. So some of my suspicions that it may be something a bit more exciting proved to be unfounded, unfortunately.
And do we think that's on the Ferrari as well?
I doubt it, because Ferrari have a different cooling setup. They feed a lot less from the roll hoop area, and everything tends to be packaged in the side pods or from the airbox. So I don't think it's going to be copied over on the Ferrari. It's just how Sauber have decided to lay out the back of the car.
Scarbs, as ever, brilliant analysis. Thanks so much. Look forward to seeing you at Barcelona 2. That's the third test of the 2015 season, where, of course, we await the 2015 Force India. Look forward to that. Thanks, Scarbs.
Thank you, Peter.